What's the hardest family conversation you've never had?
When my parents stood on the pier in their matching windbreakers and waved my brother off like he was boarding a royal yacht instead of a floating buffet, they told me they couldn't afford to take us both, and I nodded with a smile I've used my whole life whenever I'm being told I'm generous enough to understand. But the smile tasted metallic and old in my mouth, and while they filmed his departure on a phone I pay for, under a data plan I negotiate every year, I quietly decided that if they could afford to forget me, then I could afford to become unforgettable in a way they wouldn't like. I didn't make a scene on the dock, because scenes are for people who think the audience cares, and the truth is that my parents have always cared more about the optics of family than the weight of it. So I kissed my mom's cheek, told my dad to wear sunscreen, and watched my brother throw his arms wide in that way he does when he believes the world is a stage built for his late entrance, while I kept count in my head like an accountant with a grudge, one cruise ticket on their card, but covered by the gift fund I started during the lockdown, one luggage set bought with reward points I'd accrued from paying their utilities, one smug grin priceless, but still taxable in my personal ledger. On the drive home, my mother did the thing where she pretends to be wounded by her own choices, explaining how expensive everything is these days and how it breaks her heart that I wasn't on that ship, and I murmured that it was fine, that I loved a quiet house, that I had to catch up on work anyway, but inside I was walking through our life like it was a showroom floor, tagging items with mental stickers that said mine, because the sofa with the discreet, durable upholstery came from a Labor Day sale I found and financed. The television was bought after my brother tripped over the old one during a football game, and I covered the replacement, just to keep the peace. The fridge was a scratch-and-dent bargain I hauled in with a neighbor's dolly. And even the dutiful little coffee maker that kept my father from his ritual gas station stop every morning was a Black Friday steal I clicked to purchase while stirring the mashed potatoes at Thanksgiving. When we pulled into the driveway, my mother sighed the long martyr's exhale that always precedes a request, and sure enough she wondered if I could check that bill thing, because the water company had sent a notice. And I said of course, because habits are like vines that learn your weight and then hold you in place. But while I opened my laptop at the kitchen table, I felt those vines dry into rope, and I realized that for years I have been the invisible beam holding up a house that keeps insisting I am a guest, and I thought, fine, beams can be removed, beams can walk. The bill was not a bill, it was a reminder, and the reminder was not for them, it was for me. The account was in my name, because years ago when my brother bounced a check and my parents couldn't afford the deposit, I put down the deposit and never took my name off, which is how the reminders come to me and how the late fees land on my credit report. And as I stared at the screen, I felt the smallest, cleanest click inside, like a lock discovering its key after years of being jimmied, and the world arranged itself with the rude clarity of a fluorescent light. I brewed coffee, not out of kindness but ritual, and while the machine gurgled I opened a folder I keep for boring emergencies. The way other people keep a go bag with protein bars and flashlights, I keep scanned receipts, serial numbers, logins, transfer confirmations, the slow archaeology of a decade spent helping out, and line by line I confirmed what I already knew deep down but had never said out loud because saying it would make it real. The washer and dryer were mine, the insurance policies for the house and cars were managed by me, the streaming services that kept everyone docile after dinner were tied to my email, and the so-called family plan that lets everyone call everyone for free is only free because I pay the bill every month before the late fee hits. By the time the coffee finished, I had a list, not a wish list, not a revenge list, just an inventory of responsibility that had been dressed up as love, and I looked at it the way a jeweler looks at a tray, measuring weight and clarity and resale value. And I thought about how often my brother jokes that I am the responsible one, like it's a personality flaw, and how often my parents praise that flaw when it benefits them and scold it when I set boundaries, and I realized that responsibility without respect is just a polite word for servitude. So I did not slam a door or break a plate or draft a speech that would leave them in tears and me in shreds. I opened another spreadsheet, the one I use for taxes and sanity, and I started marking which accounts were transferable, which contracts were cancelable, which subscriptions could be paused with a single click, and I set 3 calendar reminders, one for the day their ship would reach Barcelona, one for the mid-cruise photo dump that always spikes their data usage, and one for the night. They would come home jet-lagged and smug, because timing is a spice, and I have been seasoning their lives for years. When my mother asked from the living room what I was working on, I told her I was doing a little tidying, which was true in the way a controlled demolition is tidy, and I closed my laptop and carried my coffee to my room, where I stood for a long moment in the doorway and saw it not as a refuge but as a staging area, and I felt something like glee, cold, efficient, a little mean, bubble up through the years of smiling endurance. Because if they couldn't afford to take both children on a cruise, then they certainly couldn't afford what would happen next, and while they scrolled for videos of my brother's ship at sunset, I opened a drawer, pulled out a small stack of neatly folded documents, and began the kind of packing that doesn't look like packing at all. The next morning arrived with the kind of quiet that usually means peace for other people but, for me, meant a long, steady inhale before an operation that had been assembling itself in my head for years. Because once I set the coffee to drip and opened the blinds to the small square of sun that lands on my desk, I began the slow march through my archives, the labeled folders, the cloud backups, the emails flagged in cautious yellow. And as I scrolled through confirmation after confirmation, that proved what I already knew, that I had been the invisible treasure of a family that loved the benefits of me much more than the burden of me. I felt the heat of anger thin into something sharper and more useful. A kind of professional cold that lets a person separate sentiment from signatures and decide, with a steady hand, who actually owns what. I started with the utilities because there is nothing more educational than flipping a switch and watching people notice the source of their comfort, and the record showed, in line after line of polite corporate language, that the water account, the gas account, and the electric account had been living under my name for so long that the system no longer even requested identification when I paid, so I printed the most recent statements, called each provider, and arranged scheduled transfers that would place the accounts back where they belonged on the exact date the ship was due to dock in Barcelona, which meant there would be no dramatic outages now. Only a clean administrative handoff later that would be felt like a rug tugged at ankle level rather than a punch to the chest, and, because I am not cruel, just thorough, I confirmed there would be no penalties, merely new deposits that would, for once, not come from me. From there I paged through the purchases that had been excused as family needs, the washer and dryer bought when my brother decided laundromats were for people without ambition, the television acquired after a very earnest lecture from my father about hosting the game, the sectional that I chose because it could take stains and shoulders and still look dignified, and with each item I matched serial numbers to receipts and receipts to warranty registrations bearing my email. Then I spoke with a consignment service that specializes in polite disappearances, the kind where professionals arrive during business hours when nobody is home, remove the things that never belonged to the house in the first place, and place them into a storage unit under a lock that only turns for me. And while I booked the date for the pickup, I noticed my hands were steady, the way they get when I am solving a work problem instead of a childhood. I handled the so-called family phone plan next, because that little miracle of modern life had become a leash with a bell on it, forever ringing in my pocket with notifications and data spikes and late-night streaming that did not belong to me. And, since the plan was mine in every practical sense, I called the carrier and asked for 2 changes that would occur automatically in 48 hours. First, the removal of international data add-ons for any line that was not physically in my possession, and second, the downgrading of all non-essential lines to the simplest tier available, which meant that photographs of sunsets and buffets would still send eventually, but not fast enough to feel like oxygen, and although this might be read as petty, I reminded myself that accountability always feels like pettiness to people who are accustomed to being carried. By late afternoon I had moved on to insurance, which is the sleepiest corner of every household and therefore the most powerful, and here I found the usual tangle, the home policy that lists me as the primary contact, the auto policy whose premium I reduced last spring after an hour and a half of bargaining while my father watched a documentary and called it teamwork, the small life policies my mother once called sweet, when she learned I had taken them out simply to guard against chaos. And with a handful of emails and one firm conversation, I arranged to remove myself from every point of contact and billing, set the renewals to require direct payment from the insured, and placed a reminder on my calendar to request written confirmation of those changes on the day my parents would be standing in an arrivals hall blinking at the fluorescent lights. While the daylight tilted across the floorboards and the house settled into the humming complacency I had long mistaken for belonging, I packed without packing, which means I began to move the core of my life into places that did not look like luggage. The thumb drive slipped into a vitamin bottle, the jewelry placed into a zippered pouch inside a winter boot, the keepsakes wrapped in sweater sleeves and stacked in an unremarkable grocery bag, and I did this not because I wanted to hide from them like a teenager sneaking out, but because ritual has power, and I needed to feel that every small transfer of weight from this house to my hands was a rehearsal for the larger act to come. When I finally sat down, the room neat and ordinary as if nothing had shifted, I opened one last account, the petty cache of modern adulthood, the subscription hub that holds the streaming services, the cloud storage, the premium email filters that keep my mother from forwarding me chain letters about saints who grant parking spaces, and with a few long, deliberate clicks I pointed every subscription away from the family devices and back to my personal devices only. Set a series of quiet expirations that would arrive like polite goodbyes instead of slammed doors, and then, because a lesson lands better when it is felt instead of shouted, I filed a change of address for every paper statement that still insisted on traveling by envelope, so that the first hint my parents would receive of this rebalancing would be a tidy stack of mail waiting somewhere they have never thought to look for me. 2 days into their grand voyage, while social media bloomed with my brother's filtered sunsets and my mother's captions about finally relaxing as a family, I set my alarm to the hour when Barcelona would yawn awake and our town would still be rubbing sleep from its eyes, because the work of extraction rewards the early and the patient. And I wanted each lever pulled with the kind of timing that never announces itself as drama, but still lands with the unmistakable thud of consequence, so I made tea instead of coffee to keep my hands calm, opened the window to the cool morning, and began the quiet choreography that would let me step backward out of their frame without leaving smudges they could use as a map. I started with the car problem. The modest sedan my father insists is the family vehicle, even though the title lists me as the owner, because I bailed out his loan when the interest rate jumped and the bank developed a sudden allergy to his credit score. And while my father loves to talk about the importance of maintaining property, he also loves to forget oil changes and inspections until the car coughs like a salted slug. So a month ago I had scheduled an appointment for this morning, marked it as a dental visit in our shared calendar to avoid questions, and when the shop manager confirmed my drop-off, I cheerfully gave him the work order that included 2 simple lines added last night: remove the house parking sticker and replace the remote entry fob, which meant that by dinner the car would be legally and physically mine in every way that counts, and if my father wanted to talk about the sanctity of family assets when he got home, he could do it on the bus like any philosopher, without keys. Next, I placed a call to the consignment service I had chosen for their spotless paperwork and discreet van, the kind that could pass for a florist or a courier if a neighbor grew nosy. And I confirmed the list of items with serial numbers that would not trigger an argument so much as an eerie quiet: a couch whose indentations told the story of decades, a television that had watched us more than we watched it, a washer and dryer whose thrumming had once been the heartbeat of our evenings, and I set the pickup for the morning after their return, when jet lag loosens the mind and the house feels unfamiliar anyway, and I asked for the gentle crew chief, the one who moves like a librarian, because I wanted the removal to feel like a flossing of the room, swift and strangely polite. With logistics aligning, I turned to the financial embroidery that had, for years, been mistaken for love, the little recurring payments that flutter under the line of vision until they become background weather. And working through my list, I reversed or redirected what had been flowing through me as if I were a quiet creek, so the modest monthly transfer I have been sending to my mother, just until things stabilize, received a notice that the source account had closed. The automatic charitable Donation my father liked to brag about at barbecues now billed him directly at the same amount because I am not uncharitable, merely accurate, and the subscription for my brother's coding platform, which he swears is essential to his startup dreams but mostly serves as a stage for performative ambition, expired at midnight with a cheerful automated email that thanked him for experimenting and invited him to return when he was ready to invest. Then, as the sun lifted and spread over the rug like a slow spill, I opened the family group chat, that museum of obligations hidden behind emojis and passive-aggressive thumbs-ups, and I wrote a message so bland it hummed, "Hope the trip is restful. The house is fine. I'm taking a little personal time to catch up on things," which read like domestic contentment while functioning as a soft launch for my disappearance, and almost immediately my brother responded with a grainy video of a breakfast buffet where the eggs looked confused and the fruit shone like lacquer, and he asked if I could send him the password for the premium Wi-Fi because the ship's free version was a joke, which would have been the moment I caved in any other year. But I typed that I had downgraded extras to save on waste since I wasn't using them and suggested he enjoy the ocean without a screen, adding a smile and punctuation only, and when he sent me a row of exaggerated laughing faces, I placed the phone face down and let the silence fold over us both like a napkin being set before a meal. By midday, I had visited the storage unit to confirm the lock, counted the boxes that held the bones of my adult life, arranged the shelf labels like a small act of worship to future clarity. And while I stood in that clean rectangle of rented neutrality, I felt a disagreement with my own certainty rise like a bubble. What if I am building a petty empire of receipts to avoid the simple ache of not being chosen? What if I am turning love into math because math always rewards the person who shows their work, and I let that doubt sit beside me on the metal stool until it stopped panting because I wanted to make a decision that could carry both the weight of my anger and the burden of my honesty. And when I finally rose, I understood that clarity does not owe comfort, it only owes accuracy, and today accuracy meant continuing even if a better daughter might have written a letter instead. On the way home, I drove past the pier where they had waved him off, the air still salted with someone else's celebration, and I parked by the water long enough to schedule the last automation in my carefully timed carousel. A series of polite closure emails that would roll out the evening they landed, each one crisp and unaccusing. Each one simply stating that services provided by me had concluded and any future arrangements should be negotiated directly with the parties involved, and as I pressed confirm, I felt the smallest tremor of satisfaction, not the dirty thrill of spite, but the clean hum of a machine finally turned off, and while the gulls scissored the sky and the tide tapped at the pilings like a patient collector, my phone vibrated with a new message from my mother that read, in her bright voice, that they had booked an extra excursion for my brother because he deserved a treat, and I smiled at the windshield, not from joy but from recognition, because it is always easier to feed the child who opens his mouth, and back at the house I unlocked the door to the same ordinary hallway, stepped into the same tidy room, and set my bag down in the place where a suitcase would later sit. The place that would be empty when they came home, and found that the person who held the house together had slipped the knot and pulled the thread. They landed in the late afternoon with that specific airport pallor people get from recycled air and free wine, and while the group chat popped with my mother's exclamation points and my brother's many photos of plates, I watched the blue dots without replying. Because silence is not absence when it has been engineered, it is a shape you move through, and I wanted them to step into it and feel the edges, so when the car service dropped them at the curb and they wheeled their souvenir bright luggage up the walk, they met a front door that opened easily and a hallway that smelled like lemon cleaner but held a hush I had never allowed to settle, the hush of a stage after the orchestra leaves. And my mother called my name in a voice pitched to kindness, while my father muttered that it felt odd in here, that the air was thin, which was accurate because what they were missing was the ordinary oxygen of my labor, and that takes a while to register. The first difference they actually saw, because people notice absence only when it trips them, was the living room where the sectional used to make a soft peninsula for their every evening. Now a clean rectangle of sun-silvered carpet with 4 coasters in a line like punctuation for a sentence nobody had bothered to finish, and my mother pressed her hand to her chest. Startled not by loss, but by the sight of any room that did not immediately serve, while my father walked in a small circle as if the couch might materialize if he looked from a better angle, and then he turned to the television wall and found the bracket bare as a rib, the cable coiled like a sleeping snake, and he said my name again with a softness I used to crave, which felt useful now only as a measure of how quickly people alter their tone when the screen goes dark. In the kitchen, the refrigerator door still opened at their touch, but the interior light gave a tired blink and then steadied on a single shelf of ordinary groceries with labels that did not know their faces. And my mother tugged the freezer out and found nothing but a thin patina of frost with the neat, square absence where an ice maker once lived, because the ice maker, like the fridge, like the warranty, like the delivery receipt, belonged to me. And the little blinking panel on the stove requested a time reset because power had cycled during the scheduled transfer, and although dinner could still be made with a pan and patience, dinner could not be watched, scrolled, or narrated to a digital audience, and that felt to them like deprivation. Which is how I knew the calibration had worked. My father, who prides himself on practical action, fished his phone from his pocket to call the guy about the television, and met a charming automated message that explained, in the gentlest corporate voice available, that the account had been moved to a new address at the request of the primary account holder, and new service could be established in minutes with a credit card and a small deposit. And he stared at the screen with the baffled panic of a man who has always thought paperwork was someone else's love language, then tried the insurance agent, who had already sent a tidy email asking for updated payment details, and the water company, which confirmed that tomorrow a new account would be created in his name with a startup fee waived as a courtesy, although the deposit would need to be handled today, and he put the phone down very carefully as if a nest of startled birds lived inside it. My mother walked the house the way a person checks on sleeping children, opening doors to rooms that had been gently altered rather than vandalized. The guest room where the laundry machines had spun their warm soundtrack now swept and silent, with two braided hoses kept like stitched arteries. The study where the hum of the router had once been as faithful as a clock, now a quiet shelf with the small rectangle of dust that marks where a thing truly lived. The hallway closet where stacks of toilet paper, paper towels, and cleaning supplies no longer waited like a pantry of forgiveness, and every label she encountered, when she bothered to read it, resolved eventually to my email, my card, my file, which made her whisper, "But we're family," to no one, which was the most honest thing she had said in years, because it finally admitted that family had been an argument rather than a fact. They discovered the car last, because the driveway always announces the truth without speaking, and when my father found an empty space where he once parked with the assurance of a man who believes all roads lead home, his face arranged itself into that calm he uses for traffic cops and customer service, and he scrolled through his calls until he found the shop's number, which returned him to a pleasant manager who confirmed that the vehicle had been picked up by its owner with updated credentials and a new remote, and that the old fob would not open anything now, but that all services had been paid in full, which meant there was nothing to argue about, only reality to accept. And when my father said my name yet again, a little cracked this time, I imagined the clean key pressing into my palm earlier that day, and I understood that generosity, when it is finally redirected, can feel to its former beneficiaries like theft. By evening, as the light thinned and the house settled into the pure sound of itself, my mother sent 3 texts in escalating tones: concern, confusion, correction, and then a 4th that said they were worried and would like to talk. And, because I had promised myself that revenge would never be a scream but a mirror, I answered with a single message that contained a scan of receipts organized by year, the polite transfer confirmations, the carrier's note about plan adjustments, the consignment schedule with tomorrow's date, and a soft sentence that said I would no longer be funding what was never acknowledged as mine, that any future arrangements needed to be discussed as adults with names on contracts, and that I wished them a restful night. After which I turned off the old family phone for the first time in a decade and slid the new one into my pocket, and somewhere in the quiet between those 2 clicks I felt something weighty unhook from my ribs and float, while in their dim living room they stood among clean rectangles and unhelpful devices and realized, with the slow shock of cold water, that I had not left a note because the note had been written through their comfort for years and I had simply stopped writing. Morning arrived with a thin, deliberate light that slid along the baseboards like a ruler checking an edge, and while the neighborhood shook itself awake with garbage trucks and the first impatient honks, the discreet van eased to the curb at the exact minute I had booked. Its doors opening with the discipline of a theater crew who have rehearsed their cues until muscle memory becomes grace, and I watched from the far end of the street with a coffee that had gone cold in my hands as the gentle crew chief, polite, steady, impossible to argue with, walked up the path, rang the bell, and stepped over the threshold with the quiet authority of a person carrying clipboards and serial numbers rather than accusations. After which the house began to change shape in that slow, mesmerizing way certain tides erase a footprint. First the washer and dryer slipping away on rubber wheels, then the television vanishing into a padded sleeve. Then the sectional lifting like a sleeping animal and floating toward the door, each departure signed for on a tablet that did not raise its voice, because the point was never to humiliate them. The point was to create a silence so accurate that it could no longer be confused with love. My phone chirped with messages that stacked themselves like a kind of pleading architecture. My mother's rising questions about where everything had gone and whether there had been a break-in. My father's newly careful tone asking me to please call so we could clear up the misunderstanding. My brother's accusation that I had ruined the vibe of their return and that my little stunt with the planned downgrade had made his last day on the ship a drag, and I sat with all of it long enough to feel the first old reflex twitch toward apology. Then I pressed my thumb to the screen and sent the only reply I had prepared beyond receipts, a simple invitation to meet that evening at a neutral diner 2 towns over, where the coffee is honest and the lighting is fluorescent enough to strip even the most stubborn nostalgia from a face, with the condition that we would speak in terms of what is true rather than what is hoped for, and that if they wanted a conversation about family, it would be conducted as adults who know how to sign their names. I arrived first and chose a booth against the back wall, the kind that lets a person watch both the door and the register, and when they walked in, the two of them together, smaller than I remembered. Flanked by the nervous dignity of travelers who have misplaced their itinerary, I felt something complicated loosen in my chest, not forgiveness and not triumph, but a recognition that the people who raised me are also the people who trained me to solve problems with spreadsheets and lists, and that, like any training, it can be turned toward or away. And when my mother reached for my hand and told me they had been frightened, I nodded and said I had been frightened for years, frightened that if I stopped paying, stopped arranging, stopped smoothing the path, there would be nothing left between us but the fact that one child was easier to love because he did not ask for anything except applause, and that the other child could always be counted on to find the coupon, the deal, the deposit, the plan, which is not love so much as logistics dressed in a sweater. I slid a thin folder across the table, not as a threat but as a guide, and inside were the terms that had taken me a decade to learn how to ask for, written in plain sentences that any bank would admire. No more accounts in my name for assets I do not live with or use, no more transfers labeled temporary that last longer than the furniture they purchase. A repayment schedule for the most recent big-ticket items that would not bankrupt them, but would teach the muscle of returning value to its source, and, most importantly, a request that if we are to continue as a family, then we will attend, together and in good faith, a handful of sessions with someone trained to spot favoritism when it wears the mask of tradition, after which we can decide whether to keep building or to bless and release each other into quieter lives. I told them I was not suing, I was not shaming, I was not hunting for blood in a glass of milk. I was simply done pretending that a ledger is a love letter just because it sits in a kitchen drawer. My father read in small bursts and nodded in those same small bursts, as if each clause were a mouthful of food that had to be chewed before it could be swallowed, while my mother dabbed at her eyes with a napkin and asked whether this meant I was leaving for good. And I said that leaving is not a door slamming so much as a set of hinges that no longer squeal, that I had already moved the part of me that made their lives easy, and that what remained was available only if the weight was shared. And she said they had saved to give my brother a little happiness because he had been struggling, and I said that I had been struggling too, but had learned to do it quietly, and perhaps that had been my original sin, the quiet. Then my brother arrived late as usual, slid into the booth with the clatter of a person who expects the world to widen for him, announced that the cruise had been transformative, and demanded to know why his accounts had been messed with. At which point I explained, in the same voice I use for customer support, that no one had been sabotaged. The extras had been removed because the person paying for them had opted out. And that if he found transformation aboard an all-you-can-eat vacation, then surely he could locate responsibility in a town with 3 banks and a bus route. We parted without hugs because hugs are treaties and treaties require acknowledgement of borders, and as they drove home to the newly accurate house, I drove to the small apartment I had rented under my own name with my own money. A quiet space with more light than furniture and a table that holds a bowl and a stack of keys, and I sat on the floor among the boxes that would become a life, and I listened to the thrum of a building where nobody expected me to manage their comfort. Then my phone vibrated with a final message from my mother that read, in a tone careful enough to make me set it down before I answered, that they would try the sessions if I would consider bringing back the washer because the laundromat made her dizzy. And I almost laughed because the request was so perfectly them, practical and self-protective, and I typed that we would start with the first appointment on Tuesday and see how it felt, and that the washer lived where it lived for now, later, with the window cracked to the evening and the storage receipts stacked like thin vertebrae on the counter. I wondered whether I had engineered justice or simply switched teams in the same old game. Whether vanishing is a kind of theater that looks like freedom from the cheap seats and like abandonment up close. Whether the child who finally stops carrying the load becomes a stranger by necessity or by choice. And while the apartment settled around me with the warm pops of new wood meeting new air, I allowed the question to remain unanswered, because uncertainty, when it is earned, can be a kind of peace, and because in the quiet between my phone screen going black and my eyes drifting closed, I heard a faint, familiar sound that I could not place until I realized it was only the hum of a machine I did not have to keep running for anyone but myself.